brought me to filmmaking was a desire to communicate. I think most artists, that's kind of the first thing. Express yourself, communicate. I think it was a feeling of being part of the world. I think for me, making film is you become part of the world because the process of making films, of meeting people, of going to places that you haven't been, of dealing with current issues, it just forces you to engage with the world. So in the case of Diversidad, the idea was to really understand our food industry, the global food industry, something that unites us all. So I think initially it was that kind of needed to be part of the world, but also to change the world. I think it was really, in my early 20s, I come from a very political family, and my dad was an activist. And for me, film was a tool to do the kind of thing that he did as an activist, but as a filmmaker, as an artist, as a communicator, as a storyteller. So those were the things that sort of brought me into this medium. Well, I think the initial idea of Diversidad was really to follow a group of activists who created a bike caravan. The idea was to bike from Vancouver to Tijuana, to Mexico, to the border of Mexico, and along the way to really discover, understand, and propagate, alternative for the food industry, to the food industry, to what really unites us all, the thing that we all have to do 3 times a day, eat. And yet we're realizing as how we studied the whole issue is that the food industry was something that's supposed to nourish us, is actually destroying us, not only internally, but also it was destroying our planet. And for us, it was a really big shock because the idea of farming for us had been something such a, positive thing, back to the land. But then the more we're realizing, when you look at genetically modified organism, at the type of pollution that, when you have pig factories, the soil erosion, all kinds of things that are derived from massive, monocultures, the killing of bees, the disappearance of bees, and all those things that we were looking at. We're like, okay, how come this is something that's supposed to be good for us, and yet it's. So I think that was the initial idea, was to explore. Yeah, it was to explore our food industry and to learn from the people that were involved in it. So along the way, we met tons of people, activists, farmers, undocumented farm workers. It touched on so many elements of our lives, and the film was really, the idea was to follow them and to see them interact with the people that they were going to meet. And at the same time, I think it's for us, me and Jean-Marc, the filmmaker, it was also on it's also tracking the evolution of our understanding of what was at stake, because what we thought was at stake at the beginning when we left was very different than what it was at the end of the trip. Well, my trajectory as a filmmaker is kind of odd because I didn't really set out to become a documentary filmmaker. I went to Concordia in film production, and I studied fiction. So my thing was to tell stories, work with actors, mise en scène, all that stuff. So there's a few documentary filmmakers that really moved me when I was studying film. Chris Marker is one of them. He's a French filmmaker, and his stuff is much more. It's very lyrical, very experimental, very political also, and also in Quebec, Gilles Groux. Gilles Groux is, like, for me, a very, very important figure who kind of navigated between documentary and fiction. And he was part of that sort of French Canadian new wave of the '60s, Michel Brault, Claude Jutras, all those people. So I think that, those two, and Chris Marker was part of the French new wave, Rive Gauche. So I think those two movements really influenced me a lot as a filmmaker, because they were both, what I liked about their films is that there was une recherche esthétique, yet also very political engagement. So it was not just it was not art for art's sake. It was taking film to the level of artistic and personal expression, cinéma d'auteur, but also engaging with the world, being agents of change, agents of transformation, of questioning, the sort of the political structures, and the societal structures that they felt were trapping us in things that we didn't really they didn't feel they belonged to. They were looking for, it was like in the 60s, so like there was like this explosion of new ideas of, not only as in film but also in society. So I think that's where a lot of my inspiration comes, and I think that's also connected to my dad, because my dad was an activist in the 60s in Haiti. So all that, I felt like they were in a way an expression of that movement. So that kind of like I kind of got really deeply connected to that, and that kind of led me to doing the kind of films that I do. As far as calling myself a documentary filmmaker, I don't really see myself as that, because I see myself as a filmmaker first. I don't only make documentaries. I do music videos, I do fiction, I do dance films. It just happens that right now I'm in a phase where I'm doing a lot of documentaries, but I also have a script that I'm working on that I eventually want to direct. But documentary filmmaking has been really great for me in terms of it's really made me travel a lot. I've been to Mexico, I've been to Haiti, I've been to Cuba, I've been to France. I've traveled, in Canada and Quebec. I think for me, I always looked at it that way: is that fiction makes you travel inside because you really go inside your own psyche, and documentary makes you travel outside of yourself. I think those two things are very important, because I find that's often what I felt. When I was studying film at Concordia, is that a lot of the filmmakers were so caught up in their own neuroses or whatever, or self-expression, that they were just disconnected with what was going on campus or in the world, and I had trouble relating to a lot of them, because for me, I think there's so few black filmmakers in the world, and especially in Quebec, that for me being a filmmaker is a political act. It's just, so I couldn't dissociate myself. I couldn't be just caught up in my own artistic kind of, I don't know how to call it, bubble. I couldn't be just caught up in my artistic bubble. It had to be a connection between me and the world, So that's sort of what's been a driving force in my filmmaking career. Well, I'm actually the film that I'm working on the most right now is a documentary. Also, I'm at the same time that I shot Diversidad, I started making a film about a Montreal hip hop group called Nomadic Massive, and I've been sort of following them for the last 10 years. And right now I'm in the post production of this film. So they're a very unusual hip hop group, because it's all live instruments, and the members of the group come from all around the world. So they really represent sort of Montreal, where it's at right now. You have members from France, Algeria, Chile, Argentina, Dominic, no, I think Antigua, and Haiti, and they have a member who comes in and out, who's from Iraq. So, and they rap in French, English, Spanish, and Creole. So I've been following them and telling their stories. We went to Cuba. It's really in Cuba that the group met. So the film really deals with the friendship between one of the main members of the group, Lupienza, and Alexei, who from another group called Obsession, and they've been friends from a long time. So the film is really about their friendship, but through that we get to know Nomadic Massive, and also we get to know the hip hop movement in Cuba, which is a very, very strong force right now. Like I said before, for me, like, art has always been political. I don't think it's only political, but I think for me, looking at what's happened, I just always felt, I think that's what brought me to making films, was the need for social and political change. So for me, the two things are interconnected. I do like filmmakers who are not political. It's not like the film doesn't need to be political, but I think I made a dance film that's not at all political. It's not like but I just think it's in the world that we're living in right now, and I think the urgencies of the world, I think it's imperative for me to, as much as possible, use film to make as a tool for political expression. It doesn't mean that it has to be dry and boring, and it can be funny and it can be sexy, but I think it just needs. For me, it's something that drives me. The need to engage with two audiences, to enlighten them, to myself to be confronted by the subject matters that I tackle, to really be innocent, so that walking into an idea and then really discovering, opening myself to change as I'm making them. So for me, that's really important. And I think it's, but I really don't impose it on other people. I think there are filmmakers who do make films that are not at all, they decide that they don't want to engage in that, and yet they make films that inspire me. So I go and touch, I'm inspired by tons of filmmakers, but it's true that the filmmakers that touch me the most are the filmmakers that somehow find that fine line, between that. And you have filmmakers who, like for example, one of my favorite filmmakers is Quentin Tarantino, and his films, not all his films are political, but obviously his last film, Django Unchained, is a highly political film. And yet when I see his film, I see there's always this concern to connect with the other. So whether it's in Pulp Fiction, whether it's in Jackie Brown, whether it's in Inglourious Bastard, there's always this thing where he's just not just making crazy films. There's always, whether it's Kill Bill, which, deals with some issues of feminism in it, in his own kind of warped way, But I find he's interesting in that way, that he's able to entertain and also educate at the same time. And I think that's what I'm striving for in my films. Well, I think we're at a really troubling state right now with documentary, especially like what we call one-off documentaries, because there's less and less windows on television for documentaries. And in the last 20 years, that's been the primary funders of documentary. It's been television. So for agencies like Telefilm and Sodec, if you don't have a broadcaster, you're basically not even considered, if you're over 35 years old, So the fact that more and more TVs are getting into reality and series, that means that there's less and less encouragement for filmmakers to do documentaries. So I think there's a real issue. There is documentary channel, but they're not funding a lot of films. So yeah, it's really tough right now. A lot of people now are doing crowdfunding for documentaries. They're really going out on their own and trying to get funding on the internet, or self-funding. This is a lot of what we did for Diversidad. We got a grant from du Conseil des Arts et des Lettres du Québec, and from RDRC, International Development and Research Fund. I forget. I forget the. Anyway, so we got money from Le Calque to partly fund her film, but eventually we had to, fund the film our own. So we, me and Jean-Marc are cameraman and editors on the side. So we made money on the side, and we would bring it in to make the film. So that's how we did the film. It's not the ideal model, because the film took a long time, because we had to it was like start and stop, and it wasn't like, okay, we got all this lump of money and then we were able to just get the film done in one shot. But you do what you can with what you have. That's the idea of documentary filmmaking. But it's really difficult, but I think each era has its own difficulty. I think the advantage that we have right now is that the equipment is fairly cheap. In terms of in terms of filming high definition, you can buy a camera for under $3,000, and then this idea of getting lenses and sound equipment. So the equipment is cheaper, but it's still time. You still have to pay yourself. You still have to ideally be working full time on your projects to really take them to that next level. And that's just no matter how cheap the equipment will ever get. That's just, you still got to pay rent, you still got to, pay your bills, and that's just always going to be an issue. So now that, there's a big squeeze, most of my friends who are documentary filmmakers are not really making documentaries. They're doing like reality, TV or TV series and stuff like that. So it's a really tough position. But, people are doing it, people are doing what they can, and people are finding ways of doing things. And the fact is, like, you have a festival like RIDM, and there's still a lot of amazing documentaries that are being made. So I think it's a testament to the resilience of people who have something, in their heart that they need to express, and they're finding ways to get it done. Cinema Politica, they've been very instrumental in my own growth as a filmmaker, in terms of being able to go to the screenings on Monday nights at Concordia. So just being exposed to films that I wouldn't have seen before, but also I think creating a space where people, gather, because, watching a film is not, I think for me, it's not just watching the film; it's also talking about it, discussing it. And I'm not somebody. I mean, I spend enough time on the computer making films that when I see a film, like blogging and doing all that kind of stuff, it's just I don't have the stamina for it, because I want to be with people and talking about it, film. So when you go to Cinema Politica, you're watching it on a big screen, and off sometimes the filmmakers are there, and then you also have tons of people who are interested in the political issues, or in filmmaking itself, that you can talk to. And so I made quite a few connections. I met quite a few people, quite a few local filmmakers at those screenings, and being able to discuss, what the film is about, how the story is told, does it work, does it not work, what kind of, like sort of discussing all these ideas, which are really important. Because for me, like, the whole thing with documentary is that it's not just, I think the whole question of form and content, I think it's really important to engage in that, that there's not one way of telling a story, and telling a story is also part of a bigger idea of what culture are you representing, and I think if a white person goes to Africa and tells a story about something, as opposed to an African telling a story about his own people, I think there's two different ways of telling those stories, and I think that's a discussion that needs to be talked about. What is it to go somewhere? And even for myself, when I go to Cuba, I'm making a film. I'm coming in from a sort of a North American perspective, looking at hip hop culture in that case. And I think all those questions, I think, it's so exciting to be in a space where you can talk about that and have debates. And that's something that I think Cinema Politica has done a really great job at doing. And I think their partnership with RIDM is really important. And I think they've really been, I think Cinema Politica is really, I think when people will look back at their growth as filmmaker, they'll really look at that as a pretty pivotal. And it's interesting because for me, Cinema Politica started at the same year that I started making documentary. So for me, it's like I feel like my growth as a documentary filmmaker is really intrinsically connected to Cinema Politica.